A barrage of gunshots leaves a chilling trail of violence.
The shooting with the gun.
She has 10 gunshot wounds, and she's not responsive.
The other person was just shot.
Another victim is in building 12.
And investigators are left scrambling for answers.
That's pretty crazy, cause that's like a high-end apartment. That's like where the rich people reside at.
A lot of people have a good way of hiding things.
Until one witness shines a new light on the truth.
The relationship was toxic.
She looks over and says, "We're gonna die tonight."
Someone that's evil like that, we can't let them do it to anybody else.
These boys is, when they want to get you, they gonna get you.
I'm not gonna sit here and beat around the bush with you, okay?
Nobody ever thought that someone would be so angry at a young lady.
October 2022, Tallahassee, Florida. As college midterms come to an end, a cool autumn chill envelops the Sunshine State's prominent educational hub and capital city.
Florida A&M, Florida State, Tallahassee Community College are the main colleges that are here.
The majority of the population are the college kids.
A little Southern hospitality mixed with the collegiate flair you have Tallahassee.
But just before 1:30 a.m. on October 24th, Tallahassee residents are jolted awake by the sound of gunshots.
Tell me exactly what happened.
The shooting with the gun. I don't know if they are shooting each other.
Multiple 911 calls flood in from a gated apartment complex on the city's south side.
We heard someone yelling outside, and there's a red car parked out here that hasn't moved since we heard the gunshots.
Based on what dispatchers are hearing, it sounds like someone is hurt, and it seems to revolve around this red car outside.
You see anybody in the car? They just with the door open?
Yeah, the door's open. Their windows are tinted. I can't see them.
Fortunately, police officers were nearby and they heard the shots. They went to the scene immediately.
Be advised for 199, all afternoon units are being held over at this time.
And soon officers find a red sedan that's in the parking lot.
As they approach the vehicle, they realize it's riddled with bullet holes. Inside, officers discover a young black woman who appears to have passed away from a hail of gunfire.
She has 10 gunshot wounds, and she's not responsive.
But investigators soon learn she's not the only victim.
Another victim is in building 12.
Another person shouts them down and she then takes them to her apartment.
There, officers locate a second victim who's also suffering from multiple gunshot wounds.
I think she's got 2. I got a 1 exit, 2 exit back there. Turning to the arm.
As officers apply pressure to her wounds, the woman tells them her name is Chloe.
The dead woman police saw in the car outside is her friend, Marlacia Kitchen.
Although she was only 17 years old, it was clear to all that Marlacia Lacey Kitchen was bound for success.
Once my grandbaby was born, I loved her a lot. That was my princess. She was a sweet little girl. She loved everybody.
She was so beautiful. Not just on the outside, but on the inside as well. She was like strong-minded, a willing person. She was determined.
Like, as soon as elementary and the middle school shift, it was like Lacey was about her business.
She had this idea that, I don't want to work for anybody when I get grown. So we invested with her and gave her the money so she could start Imperial Galore.
Imperial Galore was one of her bigger businesses that she was creating. It was a boutique, and she sold trendy clothes, and she also sold swimwear.
Eventually, Lacey created a second brand to branch out into wigs and hair accessories, named Goated Laces.
I was like, whoa, okay. I was very
surprise for a young girl to try to pursue that stuff at a young age. But she is very smart.
I know she was gonna go like crazy with them because like she almost like a boss type person, you know, like independent, do her own stuff.
With 2 successful businesses, Lacey was already thinking ahead to her next big move.
One of her goals were, I want to travel all the way over to Japan and China. I want to meet my vendors firsthand to find out where my things are coming from.
She believed in herself, and before anybody else can believe in you, you must believe in yourself.
By age 16, Marlacia was done waiting around.
She had the opportunity of watching her business grow, for a while, and it's like, I gotta get this diploma, and I don't want to be in school forever.
I was able to help my granddaughter, push through and graduate at 16.
After graduation, Lacey felt like she was ready to take on the world, and she was also ready for love.
She never dated a guy until she graduated from high school. She asked me, could she date? And I said yes. She was just like, I'm not the type of person to just keep dating different guys.
Lacey only had eyes for one person, 18-year-old Jabril Griffin.
She been knowing him ever since they was going to summer camps, or you know how they be in the mall, they be on Facebook, Instagram, whatever, however.
She introduced him as her boyfriend. I found him to be a very supportive and loving person who gave a lot to ensure that her businesses were doing what they needed to do and that she was on point.
With her support system by her side, Lacey's ambitions continued to flourish.
She wanted to grow her business even more, so she started cosmetology school and planned to go to Florida A&M University after that.
Once she finished school, she would be able to sell wigs and do hair, and then she was gonna brand all the business together, like Imperial Galore and the hair salon together.
If that wasn't enough, Lacey also picked up a job working at a local nursing home.
It takes a lot to pour into others, and for her to be so young and to work those hours and still, focus on getting ready to be a great college student and, just doing great things. It just said a lot about her as a person. She worked hard to get the things that she wanted.
Before long, Lacey even got her own place.
She moved out so she can be in town, because we live way in the country of Tallahassee. We already had the plan to get a apartment close to the school so she can just easily just get there and get home and be safe. That was the plan.
I think she really just wanted to be able to experience that college life, working hard, being able to call home and, hey, what y'all doing? Just to get a feel of the real world as a college student.
But now, instead of building the future she always dreamed of, Lacey's life has been tragically cut short at the tender age of 17.
She was so young. She was just so young.
After responding to calls of a shooting at a gated apartment complex, police have found Lacey inside a car riddled with bullet holes.
A young person dying unexpected, and how she died, that was tragic.
And although it's too late for Lacey, a second victim, her friend Chloe, is still clinging to life.
Turn into an arm. Hey, breathe for me. Breathe. I'll breathe with you. Focus on breathing. In and then out.
Chloe had been shot 4 times, so she's placed into an ambulance and transported to the hospital right away.
At this point, Chloe is the key to figuring out what happened here, but will she survive?
At just 17 years old, Marlacia Lacey Kitchen was a young entrepreneur running 2 successful businesses in Tallahassee, Florida.
The things that people work years and a lifetime to achieve, she had that right there in front of her.
In my eyes, like, she was gonna be like a millionaire, no cap. Cause she was on her grind, like she knew the hustle.
But now, Marlacia and her friend Chloe have been caught in a hail of gunfire just southeast of the city. Unfortunately, Lacey didn't survive the attack, but her friend Chloe still has a chance.
So Chloe's transported to the hospital, and doctors are trying to save her and trying to stabilize her condition.
Meanwhile, investigators continue processing the crime scene.
These are seasoned investigators, but they're in awe as to the number of bullets that they see.
In total, they find an astounding 42 shell casings scattered around the scene.
Obviously, like, it wasn't no accident, for sure.
To investigators, it's clear this was a personal attack.
42 shells. If you shoot somebody one time, your intent was to kill. So what you think is 40 times? Your intent was to kill.
But while the motive behind the murder remains a mystery, detectives discover a major clue from the shell casings.
There were 3 different shells at the scene.
There were 40, 45, and 556 cartridges, meaning more than one weapon was used.
So 3 different people were shooting, 3 people.
Detectives soon locate more critical evidence.
While they're investigating and they're looking inside the car, they find both ladies' cell phones.
In hopes of tracking down a witness, investigators start going door to door around the apartment complex.
Police department! What did you hear?
I didn't know if it was fireworks. I didn't know what it was. There was a lot. And I was like, I don't know what's happening. So we kind of freaked out at the same time, but we didn't see anything.
Did you hear anyone talking or screaming or anything?
No, I didn't hear any screaming.
Even the woman who helped Lacey's friend, Chloe, doesn't have anything new to tell the investigators.
I don't know if somebody was actively coming after her or what, so I was just trying to get her in.
Did she say anything to you guys?
Just somebody shot her and her friend was dying. She felt like she was dying.
With their canvas coming up empty, investigators try looking into the next best thing: surveillance footage.
9 times out of 10, most all gated communities have cameras. And over there in Southwood, that's one of the good sides of town, where you have to make some money to live in.
But in this case, investigators are out of luck.
Is there a camera over there?
No.
Okay, that's what I thought.
There's no camera.
Okay, all right. So that's it. Okay, thanks, sir.
There was no security cameras at that location.
That's pretty crazy, cause like that's like a high-end like apartment, you know. That's like where the rich people reside at. That ain't like no hood or nothing like that.
In speaking with apartment management, investigators are also surprised to learn that neither Marlacia nor Chloe are residents there.
So now the question is, what were they doing there in the first place?
As police continue processing the crime scene, the heartbreaking news reaches Marlacia's family.
I had got 2 or 3 texts from my daughter. So I called her, I said, what's going on? I said, you keep calling me. She said, you need to come home right now. Lacey died. I said, what? Oh my God. I screamed to the top of my voice.
It's like a nightmare. You hear about people getting shot all the time on TV, but just to hear your family hit home.
It just kind of like the world just stopped.
When detectives sit down with Marlacia's family, they have no idea what she and Chloe were doing at the apartment complex that night.
They asked me, did I know who lived in there? Do I know why they were there? And I told them no. Because she didn't live there, so I don't know why they were there.
But the family does have another vital piece of information for investigators.
He was asking me about, did my granddaughter ever mention, was she having any issues? I told him that she was having problems with Jabril. She said he was delusional.
Following the shooting that killed 17-year-old Marlacia Lacey Kitchen and injured her friend Chloe, investigators are speaking with Lacey's family.
We was trying to figure out who did it and why.
The family says there's only one person that has a problem with Lacey, her on and off boyfriend, Jabril Griffin.
All of a sudden, we was like, well, where Lacey's boyfriend? Anybody seen Lacey's boyfriend? Anybody heard from him?
Lacey's grandmother says she always had a bad feeling about Jabril.
I don't have nothing against anybody, but if I meet you, then I can pick up your vibes and then I know that you're not good.
In fact, Felicia says she tried to warn Lacey against dating Jabril.
I told her, I mean, that's your choice, but I'm letting you know. You asking me, and I'm telling you not him, not Jabril.
But Lacey didn't heed her grandmother's warning.
She tells police that they've been dating off and on for quite some time in a very contentious relationship.
Sometimes we can tell our kids, I don't think that's right for you or this and that, but, you know, love is blind.
And Felicia says recently Jabril allegedly became violent towards Lacey.
I told him, yeah, because she was just telling me last night Jabril was delusional. She told me he broke her phone, he broke her TV, and she was just like he was getting to be really violent. That's what she was saying. It was, these behaviors was not normal.
Jabril was never arrested or charged in connection with this alleged incident. But now he's investigators' top suspect in Lacey's murder.
Now they're questioning whether or not there was a domestic violence situation going on.
We didn't have evidence, but once you see them red flags, you got to take heed of them. Once you start seeing them, it's just gonna get worse, worse, and worse.
In reviewing the contents of Marlacia's phone, investigators discover photos that seem to support the information they've just learned from her family.
They find pictures of Lacey with injuries to her face, where possibly she had been beaten or hit.
And when investigators do a deeper dive on Jabril Griffin, they learn that at just 18, he already has a lengthy rap sheet.
Jabril was a registered gang member. The organization criminally affiliated and being monitored and watched by police.
He's been arrested for robbery with a firearm and illegal firearms possession, and he's currently on felony probation.
Lacey may not have been aware of Jabril's true colors until it was too late.
A lot of people have a good way of hiding things from people who may be very close to them, family members, friends, significant others.
The Sunday before she passed away, she said, Jabril, he got 2 new friends, something is going on with them. And I said, well, you need to stay back from those type of people. But Monday morning, she's dead.
And as detectives continue their investigation into Jabril, they uncover another bombshell.
Jabril lived at the apartment complex where Lacey was killed.
For police, everything is starting to add up. However, before they can investigate Jabril any further, they get the call they've been waiting for.
They get a call from the hospital saying that Chloe is in stable condition and is able to talk.
The detectives are eager to speak with her.
Did she witness who shot her and Lacey?
But according to their colleagues, she hasn't been entirely cooperative so far.
Chloe is hesitant about telling what happened. She did not want to fully cooperate with the police. She doesn't want them to go through her cell phone.
What is she hiding?
Tallahassee detectives investigating the shooting death of beloved teenage entrepreneur Marlacia Lacey Kitchen have just arrived at the hospital to speak with her friend Chloe, who was also injured in the attack.
My job is to work for you and is to work for her family. That's why we are here. So can you tell me what happened? and why Paula would do this.
But Chloe is hesitant to divulge too much information.
With her being insistent on them not going through her cell phone, this is going to raise several flags with the police.
What is she hiding?
Detectives decide it's time to lay it all on the table.
I'm going to tell you the truth the whole way. Sometimes it hurts, but it will help in the end, I promise.
So police then tell Chloe that Lacey did not make it. Lacey is deceased.
I'm so sorry. And I am sorry to give you that bad news now. It's a scary thing you've ever gone through. But someone that's evil like that, to do this to her, to do this to you, we can't let them do it to anybody else. We got to get some justice.
Once reality sinks in, Chloe has a change of heart.
She began to cooperate fully with the police.
Chloe explains that she and Marlacia have been friends for years, and on the night of the shooting, they got together for Lacey to do her hair.
But they didn't do that because Lacey seemed to have been bothered by something.
When Chloe asked what was wrong, all Lacey said was it had something to do with Polo.
Polo was Jabril's nickname. Chloe confirmed the relationship between him and Lacey was toxic.
Chloe says Lacey couldn't focus on anything else, so they decided to go for a drive. And eventually, Lacey drove them to Jabril's apartment complex.
Now it's the early part of the morning, early morning.
Lacey called Jabril on the cell phone, and they got into an argument.
They were arguing about the status of their relationship.
Moments later, they spotted Jabril driving a silver sedan through the complex. Lacey hit the gas and took off after Jabril.
They drive off. She's chasing him and driving crazy and reckless, like a female who's angry.
Suddenly, the car came to a stop, and Jabril emerged. But he wasn't alone.
Chloe describes to police what she sees is Jabril walking up with other men behind him.
Chloe says she could immediately tell she and Lacey were in serious danger.
She was just like, I don't know why Lacey had so much faith in Jabril, knew he was gonna hurt us when we got over there that night.
Chloe looks over at Lacey and says, "We're gonna die tonight."
And then gunshots rang out.
Jabril opens fire. He begins to shoot. Chloe, in the nick of time, managed to slide her seat back and missed the brunt of the gunfire.
That really saved her life.
Chloe says the bullets were flying so fast, she believes Jabril must have been using a switch on his gun.
Semi-automatic, it goes like this, pow, pow, pow. On when you switch it, pow, 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 just faster.
These boys is, when they want to get you, they gonna get you.
Once the shooting stopped, Lacey was barely conscious, clinging to life.
Meanwhile, Jabril and the other shooters took off in the silver sedan. Once the coast was clear, Chloe exited the vehicle.
She said she got out the car and ran and got help.
Despite Chloe's initial reluctance to cooperate, police believe her story.
In the beginning, Chloe was only giving them vague information. For whatever reason, maybe it was fear of retaliation.
But now, Tallahassee police finally have an eyewitness linking Jabril Polo Griffin to the crime.
Let me ask you this. If you were at the mall food court and Polo were walking by, would you recognize him immediately? No. Thank you for talking to me. We got a good team and we're going to do everything we can to get you guys justice.
The realization that Jabril has been identified as one of the gunmen in Lacey's murder is a tough pill for her loved ones to swallow.
I was in a state of shock. I just couldn't see how nobody could stand with my family at her graduation and then do her like that.
You would think someone that's like super close to you, like a loved one, is there to protect you instead of harm you. So that was like really threw me off for like a whole loop.
With the details of the crime coming into focus, it's time to bring Jabril in for questioning.
Give us peace. You know, if you can't give us Lacey, give us peace.
There's just one problem. Investigators can't find him anywhere.
Police know that Jabril probably won't come back to the apartment complex, so they take the information that they received from Chloe and they issue a bolo for the silver sedan he was driving.
We want justice. We need justice.
After interviewing the sole survivor of a deadly shooting in Tallahassee, detectives have zeroed in on Jabril Griffin as the prime suspect in the murder of his girlfriend, 17-year-old Marlacia Lacey Kitchen. But tracking down Jabril will be easier said than done.
They haven't found Jabril as of yet, but they filed a subpoena to get his phone records.
As investigators wait for the phone records to come in, they try every other avenue to locate Jabril.
They're looking everywhere for Jabril, even using Chloe's description of the silver car to reference traffic cameras in the area.
Meanwhile, Lacey's family lays her to rest with help from Tallahassee's tight-knit community.
We planned a funeral, and I was just like trying to do everything and trying to make sure everybody could come or whatever. And I just would give my granddaughter the best I could, because that's the last that I could do. That's the last thing I could do for her.
The funeral was, it was sad, but it was beautiful. A beautiful casket. It was clear, pictures of her everywhere. It was packed, flowers everywhere. Felicia laid her to rest good. She really did.
Following the funeral, Lacey's loved ones and investigators alike are more determined than ever to track down Jabril, one way or another. And soon, their efforts pay off.
They discovered the silver sedan was abandoned a short distance from the crime scene, and upon further investigation, they see that there's no evidence inside the car.
But when investigators run the plates, they're surprised to learn the vehicle isn't registered to Jabril.
Once police run the tag, the car comes back registered as a rental car.
And the name of the woman who rented the car isn't familiar to investigators. However, when police contact her, she agrees to come to the station for an interview, accompanied by her daughter, Jamie.
Jamie tells police she re-rents vehicles to others for profit.
Her typical customers are people who may not want to rent cars in their name for one reason or another.
So mom rented the car for you to drive, and you kind of like re-rented it almost in a way like on yours. It was for you.
However, when detectives ask about Jabril, Jamie says she didn't rent the car to him, although she's rented vehicles to him in the past. This time, the car was rented to Jabril's friend.
The agreement was the 21st to the 24th, right? Okay, so he picked it up on the 21st. Do you remember what time he picked it up on the 21st?
I picked it up at 12.
At 12?
Mm-hmm.
Jamie doesn't know what Jabril's friend did with the car once she rented it out to him, but he returned it on October 24th around noontime.
So did you like inspect the car, make sure it was all good and everything?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's fine.
It was fine.
Jamie says when Jabril's friend returned the car on the afternoon of the 24th, he wasn't alone.
He was accompanied by a man, and he's not the only man that showed up.
While they're returning the car, a third man drives up to pick up those two individuals, and that third man was Jabril Griffin.
Jamie explains that later that same day, she rented the silver sedan out to another unrelated individual, which is how it ended up where police found it. Based on this information, detectives have to wonder, could the same two individuals who dropped off the silver sedan be Jabril's accomplices from the night of the murder?
Chloe said Jabril had a crew with him, and so far, there's no lead on who those men could be.
When detectives look into Jabril's friends, they realize the two men are no strangers to law enforcement. One of them appears to be part of the same gang as Jabril, and the other is a known associate of the gang.
So police also subpoena the social media records for these guys.
Looking through the social media pages of Jabril's friends, police find a chilling photograph.
One post stands out on October 15th of 3 men holding guns.
One of the men in the photo appears to be Jabril Griffin.
As for those guns, detectives noticed they look like the same caliber of guns used in Lacey's murder.
And when investigators get their hands on Jabril's phone records, they uncover even more damning information. On the night of Lacey's murder, Jabril and his friend who rented the sedan were communicating with each other.
They were also near the physical location in the apartment complex where the homicide took place.
But the most important discovery comes from Jabril's recent phone activity.
They were also able to ping his phone to determine his direct location.
It comes back to an address in South Tallahassee, one that just so happens to belong to a member of Jabril's family.
Now, they finally have their prime suspect in view.
Florida police investigating the murder of Marlacia Lacey Kitchen have just tracked her fugitive ex-boyfriend to a relative's home in South Tallahassee.
Tallahassee police contacts the U.S. Marshals Fugitive Apprehension Team. That's where they go in and take down dangerous felons. This person has been involved in a homicide. They take no chances.
As the task force descends on the home, they notice someone from inside quickly open and close the front door.
Someone peeps out, recognize who's outside, and then they abruptly close the door and go back inside the house.
Immediately, they order anyone inside the home to come out with their hands up. When no one emerges from the home, the investigators decide to lay in wait.
He could be armed and dangerous, ready to resist, ready to fight, ready to shoot.
Finally, after a tense 30-minute standoff, Jabril Griffin emerges from the home in surrender.
Finally, he was taken off the street.
And while Jabril's arrest is a major step for detectives, for Lacey's family, it's far from closure.
I was like, okay, they got him. But I still had a lot of questions. A lot of things still played in my head, like the whys. It was still a lot of whys.
It still don't bring back the fact that she gone.
After he's arrested, the search of the premises showed that he had buried his cell phone at the bottom of a potted plant.
He think that they weren't gonna find him in the plant. Really?
But unfortunately, he was smart enough to factory reset the phone before burying it, so there would be no information that could be recovered from the phone.
Back at the station, detectives sit down with Jabril.
I'm not so good at math, so you're how old? 18.
And despite Jabril's young age, detectives don't go easy on him.
I'm not gonna sit here and beat around the bush with you, okay? You know why you're here, I know why you're here, we both know why you're here. We can play the game. I've been doing this a while, and I know you've been arrested before, so here's where I'm at with this. You wouldn't be here if we didn't have warrants for you, right? So I know what happened. I can prove what happened.
But instead of giving his side of the story, Jabril shuts down the interview.
Are you willing to talk to me about what happened? No. You said no? No. Okay. So that's your right?
He invokes his Fifth Amendment right to remain silent and request a lawyer. At that point, police cannot question him at all.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and document this. We're gonna work on your paperwork and get you transferred as quickly as we can, okay?
After Jabril lawyers up, police charge him with first-degree murder and attempted first-degree murder.
Despite investigators' suspicions, they aren't able to charge any of Jabril's friends as accomplices in the crime.
Even though the police suspected they were the shooters, Chloe was only able to ID Jabril.
As prosecutors prepare for trial, they begin to formulate their theory of what happened on the night of October 24th.
On October 24th, this relationship between Lacey and Jabril finally came to a head.
I know a lot of people think that when you're going through that, just get out of it. It's just not that easy.
It's hard to kind of break away when you have a romantic involvement with someone. You want to believe the best in this person.
After that last argument, my theory is he probably felt disrespected and he was waiting for the opportunity to do what he did. And he told his boys, we're gonna go and take care of this situation permanently.
Nobody ever thought that someone would be so angry at a young lady.
After the men emptied their clips, they got back in the rental car and fled the apartment complex.
That was not just like a spur of the moment thing, it just happened. It was not. It was not something that just happened.
You don't think that someone that you're with probably almost every day would be someone that takes your life.
As Jabril's trial date approaches, Lacey's loved ones are eager to see justice served.
I was hoping that the justice system would do what it is intended to do by him being prosecuted and sentenced.
But at the 11th hour, Jabril decides to make a deal with the prosecution.
They called me the day before, oh, he gonna take a plea deal tonight.
When the prosecution offers you a deal, there's some doubts in their minds as to getting a guilty verdict. Whatever that doubt is, we don't know. But obviously there was something there.
In exchange for his guilty plea, Jabril's charges are reduced to manslaughter and attempted murder.
He didn't get but 15 years.
For Lacey's family, the 15-year sentence isn't enough.
I feel like judge ain't do a good job, but like they must know something we don't know.
My daughter, she was just like, how you could get 15 years for killing my baby? And if I was to go out there and just rob some or whatever, I'd get 15 years. So she not really understanding that.
He'll be, what, 30-some years old? He's still young. It's not fair. It's just not fair. I mean, it's not fair.
It looks more like a slap on the wrist.
There are still the other shooters to consider, and Lacey's family won't have peace until they're brought to justice.
Right now, you got one person, but there's more people out there. I ain't gonna be able to rest. I don't even get no good night's sleep. I want everybody in jail that had anything to do with it. I'm not gonna be able to move on till everybody is in custody.
Anybody involved should have consequences. That's how I feel though. Like, at least get everybody.
We want everybody who had something to do with it locked up. Point blank. We want justice. That's all we want.
Today, those who loved Lacey hope her story becomes a lifeline for other young women.
You know, being in an abusive relationship that is fatal. She was so young, and if somebody can see her story, they maybe can help somebody else get out of it.
It forces you to put things in a different perspective. You don't take anything for granted.
We need to let everyone know violence isn't the way, but most importantly, I just want her name to just be remembered as a young role model. She was a leader, she was smart. She was everything a lot of young women her age were destined to be.
I want Lacey's legacy to be remembered like in an inspiring way. I would say for younger girls to keep your spark. Don't let anybody tell you, oh, you can't do this because you're this age, or oh, you can't do this because of what you look like. You have the ability to do literally anything if you put your mind to it.
Wake up and live your dream. That is one of the pieces that Lacey quoted back to me.
My grandbaby is gone. There's nothing I can do but just fight for justice for her. And I let her know when I pray, I let her know. I say, I'm going to be fighting to the end for you.
On the night of March 1st, 1932, the Lindbergh estate near Hopewell, New Jersey, was quiet. Inside the house, 20-month-old Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. was asleep in his nursery on the second floor. To most families, the hours after a child has been put to bed are ordinary and familiar. But this was not an ordinary family. The child's father, Charles Lindbergh Sr., was one of the most famous men in America, known around the world for his historic solo flight from New York to Paris in 1927. His name carried an extraordinary weight. His face was recognized. His family was known. Yet despite that fame, the Lindberghs had chosen to live away from the intense attention of the public. On a large property near Hopewell, it was supposed to offer privacy. Instead, it became the setting for one of the most notorious crimes in American history. Sometime that night, an intruder approached the house. The details that investigators would later reconstruct were simple, but deeply disturbing. A homemade wooden ladder was placed beneath the window of the nursery. The person who had brought it used it to reach the second floor. Somehow, the intruder entered the nursery and took the sleeping child away. The ladder was later found damaged, having broken or separated at one of its joints during the attempt. Beneath the window, investigators would discover traces that suggested someone had been there. Inside the nursery, there were signs connected to the intrusion. But at the moment the crime was discovered, no one knew who had entered the house, how the child had been taken without immediate detection, or where the intruder had gone. The first indication that something was wrong came roughly an hour later. Betty Gow, the child's nurse, discovered that Charles Jr. was no longer in his room. The child was gone. At first, the family searched the house. Perhaps he had been moved somewhere else. Perhaps there had been some terrible misunderstanding. But the search quickly revealed something much more serious. On the window ledge, there was a note. It was not a message from someone asking for help. It was a ransom demand. The writer demanded $50,000 in exchange for the child's return. The note was written in English, but it contained numerous spelling mistakes and awkward expressions. At the end was a distinctive symbol, resembling a circle with two dots. That symbol would appear again in later ransom communications and would become one of the identifying features investigators associated with the kidnapper. In a matter of minutes, the meaning of the empty nursery changed. This was no longer simply a missing child investigation. Someone had entered the Lindbergh home, taken a 20-month-old boy, and demanded money for his return. The circumstances immediately created an impossible question for the family. How could they respond quickly enough to save their child when they did not know who had taken him or where he was being held? The New Jersey State Police soon became the principal investigative force. The FBI also became involved, but the federal government's authority was more limited than it would become in later decades. At the time, the FBI did not possess the same federal jurisdiction over ordinary kidnapping cases that it would later acquire. The investigation therefore developed largely through state authorities, while the extraordinary fame of the Lindbergh family ensured that the case would attract enormous public attention. Charles Lindbergh himself did not simply remain on the sidelines. He used his contacts and influence to search for someone who might communicate with the kidnapper. What followed was a prolonged exchange of ransom communications. Over the weeks that followed, the family received 13 letters connected with the demand for money. The amount being demanded changed during the negotiations, eventually rising to $70,000, although the ransom that was ultimately delivered was $50,000. Every message carried the same fundamental promise: money in exchange for the child. Yet behind that promise was a growing uncertainty. Was Charles Jr. alive? Was he being held somewhere nearby? Was the kidnapper telling the truth? Each communication created another opportunity for the family and investigators to act. But each also carried the possibility of deception. Eventually, a man named Dr. John F. Condon became involved. Condon was a former school principal living in the Bronx. He offered to act as an intermediary and became the person who would communicate directly with the individual calling himself John. The name itself was little more than an identity supplied by the kidnapper. Condon had no independent way of knowing who stood behind it. Yet through the correspondence, he became increasingly important to the ransom negotiations. The man calling himself John directed Condon toward the eventual exchange. Condon would later describe the person he believed he had encountered, and investigators would use that description to create a sketch. But at this stage, the identity of the kidnapper remained unknown. The ransom exchange eventually took place. Condon carried $50,000, much of it in gold certificates, and handed the money over as instructed. In return, he received a message claiming that the missing child was aboard a boat called Nellie near Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. It was the kind of information that could have offered the family hope. If the message was true, perhaps the child could finally be brought home. Search efforts were immediately directed toward the information provided. But the search produced nothing. There was no child waiting on the boat. The promise contained in the message led nowhere. The money had been delivered, but Charles Jr. had not been returned. Then, on May 12, 1932, more than 2 months after the kidnapping, the case took its darkest turn. A man searching for firewood discovered the body of a child in an area approximately 4.5 miles from the Lindbergh home. The remains had been badly affected by the passage of time and had been buried only superficially. The child was Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. The medical examination concluded that he had died around the time of the kidnapping and that the cause of death was a severe blow to the head. The discovery transformed the meaning of everything that had come before it. The ransom notes, the negotiations, the money, the mysterious figure calling himself John, the search for the child, all of it now belonged to a case involving not only kidnapping but murder. The family had paid the ransom hoping that their son would come home alive. He never did. And now investigators faced an even more difficult question. Why had the child been killed? The available facts did not establish a definitive answer. There was no certainty about the kidnapper's motive for causing the child's death. What investigators did have was a crime scene, a damaged homemade ladder, ransom correspondence, a trail of money, and a mystery that would remain unresolved for more than 2 years. The investigation would eventually lead to a German-born carpenter named Bruno Richard Hauptmann. But on that night in March 1932, his name was still unknown. There was only an empty nursery, a ransom note, and a family confronting the unimaginable absence of a child. The search for Charles Jr. had begun as a desperate attempt to bring him home. It would become one of the largest and most consequential criminal investigations in American history. Before the kidnapping became a national investigation, before the ransom letters and the courtroom testimony, there was a child at the center of the story, Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., only 20 months old. His life was brief, and the circumstances surrounding his death would eventually become known across the United States and far beyond it. But the public attention that followed the kidnapping could easily obscure the most important fact of all. Charles Jr. was not a symbol, a headline, or simply the son of a famous man. He was a young child whose disappearance transformed the lives of his parents and became the human center of one of the most consequential criminal cases in American history. His father, Charles Lindbergh Sr., was already an extraordinary public figure. In 1927, he had completed a solo, non-stop flight from New York to Paris, an achievement that made him internationally famous. His name became associated with aviation and with a level of public attention few individuals experienced at the time. The fame was enormous, and it extended beyond Lindbergh himself to the family around him. And Morrow Lindbergh, Charles Jr.'s mother, was part of that highly visible household. Together, Charles Lindbergh Sr. and had established a family life that they hoped would provide some distance from the public world surrounding them. Their home near Hopewell, New Jersey, stood on a large property of approximately 390 acres. The location offered a degree of privacy away from the crowds and attention associated with Lindbergh's fame. Yet the same isolation that could make a place feel private could also create a different kind of vulnerability. On March 1, 1932, The Lindbergh home became the scene of a crime that would soon attract the attention of investigators, journalists, and the public across the country. The family had no reason to expect that the nursery upstairs would become the focus of an investigation. Charles Jr. was 20 months old and was sleeping in his room on the second floor. At approximately 9 o'clock that evening, the child was in the nursery. What happened afterward would be reconstructed through the physical evidence investigators found at the property. But at the moment the crime was taking place, the family did not know that an intruder was approaching the room. A homemade wooden ladder was positioned beneath the nursery window. It was not a conventional ladder simply taken from a store or presented as an ordinary household object. It had been constructed from pieces of wood, and its eventual condition would become one of the most important physical aspects of the investigation. The person who used it reached the second-floor window and entered the nursery. Charles Jr. was taken from the room. The circumstances were extraordinary because the child was removed from the home without the family immediately realizing what had happened. The ladder was damaged during the attempt. Investigators later found indications around the window and evidence inside the nursery that helped them understand that the disappearance was not accidental. But the physical clues could not immediately answer the most urgent question. Where was the child? The discovery of his absence came roughly an hour later, when his nurse, Betty Gow, found that he was no longer in the nursery. The family searched the house, and the seriousness of the situation soon became clear. The child had not simply wandered into another room. Someone had taken him. Then came the message that transformed the disappearance into a ransom kidnapping. On the window ledge was a letter demanding $50,000. The language of the note was imperfect, containing spelling errors and awkward expressions. Yet the intention behind it was unmistakable. The writer was demanding money in exchange for the child's return. A distinctive symbol appeared at the end of the communication, resembling a circle with 2 dots. Similar markings would appear in later ransom letters, making the symbol one of the recognizable features of the correspondence. For Charles and Ann Lindbergh, the ransom demand created a terrible uncertainty. The person responsible was communicating, which could suggest that the child was being kept alive. But there was no independent confirmation of his condition. The family had to rely on messages from someone whose identity they did not know. Every instruction could potentially lead them closer to their son, but every instruction could also lead them away from him. The case quickly became a major investigation. The New Jersey State Police took the leading role, while the FBI assisted despite the limitations of federal jurisdiction at that time. The legal structure surrounding kidnapping investigations was different from what Americans would know in later years. The federal government did not yet possess the broad authority over ordinary kidnapping cases that would later become associated with the Lindbergh case itself. That limitation would eventually become one of the reasons the investigation had such a lasting impact on American law. But in those first weeks, the immediate concern was much more personal: finding Charles Jr. alive. Charles Lindbergh Sr. was not simply a distant figure whose name appeared in newspapers. He became directly involved in the effort to establish communication with the kidnapper. Through his contacts and influence, attempts were made to find someone who could serve as an intermediary. The ransom correspondence continued, and the number of letters eventually reached 13. The demands changed during the negotiations. The amount eventually rose to $70,000, although the payment that was ultimately delivered was $50,000. At the center of those negotiations was Dr. John F. Condon, a former school principal living in the Bronx. Condon offered himself as an intermediary and became the person who communicated with the individual, identifying himself as John. That name provided investigators with an identity of sorts, but it did not reveal the man's real name. Condon later described the person he believed he had encountered as having a Scandinavian appearance, and investigators used the description to prepare a sketch. For the family, however, the identity of the person behind the name mattered less than the question of whether their son was still alive. Eventually, Condon was instructed to deliver $50,000. The ransom consisted largely of gold certificates, which were used as a significant part of the payment. After the money was handed over, Condon received information claiming that Charles Jr. was aboard a boat named Nellie near Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. The information gave the family another possible location to search. The search produced no child. There was no reunion. The information did not lead investigators to Charles Jr. Instead, the case moved deeper into uncertainty. The ransom had been paid, but the central promise of the kidnapping had not been fulfilled. For more than 2 months, the fate of the child remained unresolved. Then came May 12, 1932. A man searching for firewood discovered the body of a child approximately 4.5 miles from the Lindbergh home. The remains were badly affected by the passage of time and had been buried only superficially. The child was identified as Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. The medical examination concluded that he had died around the time of the kidnapping. His cause of death was determined to be a severe blow to the head. The discovery ended one terrible uncertainty while creating another. The family now knew that their son would not be coming home. Investigators knew that the ransom negotiations had not been a path to a living child but part of a case involving murder. Yet the central mystery remained. Who had taken Charles Jr., and why had the child been killed? The supplied evidence did not provide a definitive answer to the question of motive. What remained were the physical traces of the crime, the ransom correspondence, and the trail created by the money. The homemade ladder beneath the nursery window would become particularly important. Its construction offered investigators a possible connection to whoever had entered the house. The ransom letters offered another trail through handwriting and language. The gold certificates would eventually create a financial trail that could be followed years later. But none of those clues immediately pointed to Bruno Richard Hauptmann. His name had not yet entered the investigation. For now, the case remained an enormous puzzle surrounding the death of a 20-month-old child. Charles Jr.'s short life had been lived largely within the privacy his parents had sought for their family. His death destroyed that privacy completely. The world now knew the name of the child who had disappeared from the Lindbergh home, and newspapers and investigators would follow the case as it developed. Yet behind all of the public attention was the same basic tragedy that had existed from the beginning. A child had been taken from his room during the night, and the promise that money would bring him home had failed. The investigation would continue for years. It would produce false leads, intense suspicion, controversial evidence, and eventually a defendant who would insist until the end of his life that he was innocent. But before Bruno Richard Hauptmann became the central figure of the story, there was Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., the child whose absence had started everything. The disappearance of Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. immediately created 2 separate problems for investigators. The first was urgent and personal. Where was the child, and could he still be found alive? The second was investigative. Who had entered the Lindbergh home? How had the intruder escaped? And what evidence had been left behind? On the night of March 1st, 1932, those questions had almost no answers. What investigators did have was a ransom note, a damaged homemade ladder, and a family facing a demand for $50,000. The ransom note was among the first pieces of evidence to give the case a definite direction. It transformed the disappearance from an unexplained crime into a kidnapping for ransom. The writer demanded $50,000 in exchange for the child's return. The amount was enormous, but the wording of the message was just as significant to investigators. The note contained numerous spelling mistakes and awkward expressions, suggesting that whoever had written it was not communicating in polished English. At the end appeared a distinctive symbol resembling a circle with 2 dots. That symbol would later appear in additional communications and become an identifying feature of the ransom letters. For the family, however, the details of spelling and handwriting were secondary to the message itself. Someone had their child, and someone was demanding money. The note offered no reliable explanation of where Charles Jr. was being held. It did not provide proof that he was alive. It simply created a condition, money in exchange for the child. The New Jersey State Police quickly became the principal investigative force. Officers faced an unusually difficult crime scene. The Lindbergh name guaranteed intense public interest, while the physical circumstances of the kidnapping created an enormous need for careful examination. The homemade ladder outside the nursery window was particularly important. It suggested a method by which the intruder had reached the second floor. Its damaged condition indicated that something had gone wrong during the attempt. Investigators also found traces around the window and inside the nursery that could help reconstruct the intrusion. But physical evidence alone could not tell investigators where the child had been taken. The FBI became involved, but the federal government's authority was limited compared with what would later exist. At that time, the FBI did not have broad federal jurisdiction over ordinary kidnapping cases. The investigation, therefore, remained primarily a New Jersey State Police matter, although federal assistance would become increasingly significant. The limitations of federal authority would later become an important part of the legacy of the Lindbergh case. For the moment, however, the investigation was concentrated on the immediate crisis. The family needed a way to communicate with the person responsible. Charles Lindbergh Sr. used his influence and contacts to help find someone who could establish communication with the kidnapper. The objective was not simply to negotiate the amount of money. It was to obtain information about the child and, if possible, secure his safe return. The ransom correspondence continued. Over the following weeks, the family received 13 letters connected with the kidnapping. Each letter represented another communication from the unknown person behind the crime. Each message could contain information, instructions, or demands. At the same time, each message created another opportunity for deception. The ransom amount did not remain fixed. The original demand was $50,000, but the amount eventually rose to $70,000 during the negotiations. Despite this increase, the actual ransom payment that was ultimately delivered amounted to $50,000. The changing demands added another layer of uncertainty to an already desperate situation. Investigators had to determine which instructions could be trusted and how the family could respond. Without losing contact with the person claiming to hold Charles Jr., there was also the problem of time. A missing child could not simply be treated as a financial negotiation. Every passing day potentially changed the situation. Yet investigators had little ability to verify what was happening away from the Lindbergh home. They had no modern communications technology, no nationwide digital databases, and no immediate way to identify the sender of an anonymous letter. The investigation depended heavily on physical evidence, witness accounts, correspondence, and the painstaking tracing of information. One of the most important developments came through Dr. John F. Condon. Condon was a former school principal living in the Bronx. He offered himself as an intermediary after making a public offer to help communicate with the kidnapper. His involvement gave the investigation a new channel. The individual responsible for the kidnapping began communicating with Condon using the name John. The name was deliberately limited. It did not reveal the person's real identity, occupation, or location. It was simply the identity the correspondent chose to use. Condon nevertheless became increasingly important because he was willing to serve as the person through whom the ransom negotiations could proceed. The communications eventually led toward a meeting and the delivery of money. Condon later described the person he believed he had encountered as a man with a Scandinavian appearance. Investigators used that description to prepare a sketch, but the description did not immediately provide a name. The man calling himself John remained a mystery. At this stage, the case contained several separate investigative threads. There was the physical evidence at the Lindbergh property. There were the ransom letters. There was Condon's communication with the anonymous correspondent. And there was the ransom itself, which investigators hoped could eventually be traced. These threads did not yet converge on a single suspect. The most immediate objective was the ransom exchange. Condon was eventually instructed to carry $50,000 to the person calling himself John. The money was largely provided in gold certificates, which would later become one of the most important features of the investigation. At the time of the exchange, however, the certificates were simply money being handed over under extraordinary circumstances. The transaction was intended to secure the child's return. After receiving the ransom, John provided Condon with a message claiming that Charles Jr. was aboard a boat called Nellie near Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. For the family, this information created another possible path to their son. If the message was true, the child might still be alive. Search efforts were directed toward the location described. But the search did not produce Charles Jr. The information did not lead to a reunion. The promised child was not found. The ransom had been paid, yet the central objective had failed. This was a devastating development because it left investigators with a disturbing possibility. The kidnapper might have deliberately supplied false information. If the information about Nellie was false, then the ransom exchange had not simply failed. It may have been designed to move investigators away from the truth. The investigation therefore continued without a living victim to guide it. The authorities now had to work from evidence left behind and from communications that might or might not be truthful. The ransom letters became increasingly important because they represented one of the few continuing connections between investigators and the unknown offender. The distinctive symbol at the end of the communications offered a potential identifying characteristic. The handwriting and language could later be examined. The repeated correspondence could also be compared for consistency. Every letter potentially contained information about the writer, even if the writer had intended to conceal his identity. Meanwhile, the damaged ladder remained at the center of the physical investigation. Its construction suggested that it had been made specifically or at least modified for the purpose of reaching the nursery window. Investigators began examining the wood, the nails, the construction, and the tool marks. Those details would become important much later when a suspect was identified. At this stage, however, the ladder was simply one of the few tangible objects connecting investigators to the unknown intruder. The case continued to attract enormous attention. The fame of Charles Lindbergh meant that the kidnapping could not remain a private tragedy. Every development had the potential to become public knowledge, while every false lead risked creating additional confusion. The investigation generated a vast number of tips and claims. Some people attempted to provide useful information. Others would eventually be shown to have no connection to the crime. The pressure on investigators grew as the weeks passed. Yet the central question remained unchanged. Where was Charles Lindbergh Jr.? The ransom negotiations had created a temporary hope that money could bring him back. That hope would soon collapse completely. On May 12th, more than 2 months after the kidnapping, the child's body was discovered approximately 4.5 miles from the Lindbergh home. The investigation was no longer primarily a kidnapping case. It had become a murder investigation. The ransom letters, the money, the ladder, and the mysterious figure calling himself John now had to be understood in the context of a child's death. The case had entered a darker stage, and investigators would have to reconstruct not only how Charles Jr. had been taken, but what had happened after he disappeared. The search for the person behind the ransom notes had become a search for a killer. By the time Dr. John F. Condon entered the Lindbergh kidnapping investigation, the case had already become a national crisis. Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. had been taken from his nursery, a ransom note had been left behind, and the family had received instructions from someone who remained hidden behind an invented identity. Investigators knew that the person communicating with them called himself John, but a name supplied by an unknown correspondent was hardly an identification. It was a thin layer of anonymity, separating the investigators and the family from the person they desperately needed to find. Condon would become the unusual link between those two sides. He was a former school principal living in the Bronx, and he became involved after offering to help establish communication with the kidnapper. His role was not that of a police officer or professional negotiator. He was an intermediary, a civilian who placed himself between a desperate family and a person demanding money for a child's return. That decision would eventually make Condon one of the most important witnesses in the entire case. The circumstances surrounding his involvement reflected the extraordinary nature of the kidnapping. Charles Lindbergh was one of the most famous people in America, yet fame could not reveal where his son had been taken. The ransom letters contained instructions, but the person writing them remained concealed. The family needed someone who could communicate with the unknown offender without immediately placing the child at greater risk. Condon offered himself for that role. His involvement created a new channel through which the kidnapper could communicate. Instead of dealing only with the Lindbergh family, the person calling himself John now had a specific intermediary with whom he could exchange messages. This was important because it transformed the investigation from a one-sided search into a direct, though highly controlled, communication. But it also introduced a new uncertainty. Everything Condon learned about the kidnapper came through a person who was deliberately trying to conceal his identity. The name John provided no reliable information about who he actually was. The correspondence remained the primary means of communication. The kidnapper continued to provide instructions and demands concerning the ransom. The negotiations were not simple. The amount involved eventually rose to $70,000. Although the payment ultimately delivered was $50,000. Every stage required decisions about whether the instructions could be trusted. The family had to consider what might happen if they refused. Investigators had to consider whether an attempt to intervene could endanger the child. And Condon had to continue communicating with someone whose true identity remained unknown. In this environment, even small details could become important. Condon was not simply carrying messages. He was also one of the few people who could later provide investigators with a personal description of the individual behind the correspondence. At some point in the process, Condon encountered the man he believed to be John. Afterward, he described the man as having what he considered a Scandinavian appearance. That description became significant because it gave investigators something more tangible than a name. They could attempt to translate the description into a physical likeness. A sketch was prepared based on Condon's account. Yet the sketch did not immediately solve the case. It was a representation of a man whose real identity remained unknown. It could be distributed and examined, but it could not by itself establish who had committed the kidnapping. The investigation still depended on the hope that another clue would connect the anonymous John to a specific individual. Condon's role became even more important as the ransom exchange approached. The kidnapper instructed him to deliver $50,000. The money was largely supplied in gold certificates, which would later prove to be a crucial part of the investigation. At the time, however, the certificates were simply the ransom. Their purpose was to secure the child's return. Condon carried out his role as intermediary and delivered the money according to the instructions he had received. The exchange represented the point at which the kidnapping's central promise was supposed to be fulfilled. The family had agreed to give the demanded money. In return, they expected information that would lead to their child. Instead, after receiving the ransom, John provided Condon with a message claiming that Charles Jr. was aboard a boat named Nellie near Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. The information offered a specific location, and that specificity could have made it appear credible. If the child was actually on the boat, then the ransom exchange had succeeded. The family and those assisting the investigation had a possible destination. Search efforts followed, but the information produced nothing. Charles Jr. was not found on the boat. The search did not result in the child's return, and the promise made by John remained unfulfilled. This failure became one of the most troubling aspects of Condon's involvement. He had helped establish communication, helped facilitate the ransom exchange, and received information that was supposed to lead to the child. Yet the child was not there. The message about Nellie, therefore, became another piece of evidence whose reliability had to be questioned. It could have been false information. It could have been intended to misdirect investigators. Or it could have reflected another explanation that the available evidence could not establish. What was clear was that the ransom had not produced the outcome everyone had hoped for. The significance of Condon's role did not end with the failed search. His recollection of the man he believed was John would later become relevant when Bruno Richard Hauptmann was arrested. Condon would identify Hauptmann as the man he had encountered. That identification would become one of the pieces of evidence used by prosecutors at the trial. But the importance of Condon's testimony also illustrates the difficulty of the investigation. The man he knew as John had intentionally concealed his identity. Condon had only a limited opportunity to observe him, and his description had to be translated into a sketch and eventually compared with a real suspect. The investigation, therefore, depended on the reliability of human memory as well as physical evidence. The kidnapping had already produced another important category of evidence: the ransom letters themselves. The messages contained repeated features, including the distinctive symbol that appeared at the end. Their wording and handwriting would later be compared with writing associated with Hauptmann. At the time of Condon's involvement, however, investigators did not yet have a known author to compare against. The letters were evidence without a confirmed writer. The same was true of the ladder. Investigators knew that the homemade wooden ladder had been used in the crime, but they did not yet know who had built it. They could examine its construction, its wood, its nails, and its tool marks, but all of those observations remained clues rather than an identification. Condon, therefore, became one part of a larger puzzle. His connection to the case offered a potential human description of the kidnapper. The ransom money offered a financial trail. The letters offered handwriting and language. The latter offered physical evidence from the crime scene. None was sufficient by itself to name the offender. The investigation required these separate threads to eventually meet. That process would take years. In the meantime, the discovery of Charles Jr.'s body on May 12, 1932, changed the meaning of every earlier event. The ransom exchange was no longer simply a failed attempt to secure the child's return. It became part of a murder investigation. Condon's communication with John now had to be examined as evidence connected to a child's death. The message about Nellie, the money, the letters, and the description of the mysterious man all became pieces of a larger effort to reconstruct what had happened. Yet there was still no name attached to John. There was no confession. There was no witness who had seen the child being taken and could identify the offender. There was only a growing collection of clues. Condon had helped bring the investigation closer to the person behind the ransom correspondence, but the identity remained unresolved. The case would soon become dominated by another kind of evidence: the money itself. The $50,000 delivered in the ransom exchange had been carefully recorded, and investigators hoped that the certificates would eventually reappear. If the person who received them attempted to spend them, those transactions might create a trail. For more than 2 years, that trail would remain incomplete. Then, in 1934, gold certificates connected to the Lindbergh ransom began appearing again in the New York area. The investigation was about to move from anonymous letters and uncertain descriptions toward something much more concrete. The person calling himself John had tried to disappear behind a name. But money has a way of carrying its history with it. And in the years ahead, the ransom itself would become the trail that finally pointed investigators toward Bruno Richard Hauptmann. The ransom payment represented the moment when the Lindbergh family had to place their hope in the hands of a person they could not see, could not identify, and could not trust. For weeks, the investigation had revolved around letters and instructions from the individual calling himself John. The messages had established a terrifying bargain: money in exchange for the safe return of 20-month-old Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. The family could not know whether the person communicating with them was telling the truth. They could not independently verify that the child was alive. Yet they had to proceed as though the promise of a return were real. The ransom was ultimately set at $50,000 for the exchange. Even though the demands had changed during the negotiations and had eventually risen as high as $70,000. The amount was enormous, and the form in which much of the money was provided would later become one of the most important elements in the entire investigation. The ransom consisted largely of gold certificates. At the time of the exchange, however, the significance of those certificates was not yet fully apparent. They were simply the money that had been agreed upon. Their immediate purpose was straightforward: give the kidnapper what he demanded, receive information about the child, and bring Charles Jr. home. Dr. John F. Condon was the intermediary who carried the responsibility of communicating with the person calling himself John. Condon had entered the case as a civilian who offered to help, but his role had grown increasingly important. He had become the point of contact through which the ransom negotiations could proceed. The arrangement allowed the family to maintain communication with the kidnapper while creating a degree of distance between the person demanding the money and the Lindbergh household. It also gave investigators a witness who had personally encountered the mysterious man known as John. Eventually, Condon was instructed to deliver the $50,000. The exchange was carried out according to the instructions that had been communicated to him. The money changed hands. For the first time since the kidnapping, there was a possibility that the central demand had been satisfied. If the kidnapper had been truthful, Charles Jr. should now have been released, or his location should have been revealed in a way that would lead directly to him. Instead, Condon received a message claiming that the child was aboard a boat called Nellie near Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. The message was precise enough to create hope. There was a name, there was a location, there was something concrete that could be searched, but there was also an immediate problem. The family did not have Charles Jr., they had only another statement from the unknown person who had already taken their child. The search nevertheless had to be made. If there was even a possibility that the child was alive and waiting at the location described, investigators had to act. The information about Nellie therefore became the next stage of the search. But the search produced nothing. Charles Jr. was not found. The boat did not provide the answer the family had been promised. The ransom had been delivered, yet the child remained missing. This was more than a failed transaction. It was a devastating moment because the family had done what the kidnapper demanded, and still there was no child to bring home. The failure also raised a fundamental question about the person calling himself John. Had the kidnapper deliberately lied about the child's location? If so, the ransom exchange had served another purpose. Instead of helping investigators find Charles Jr., the information could have sent them away from the actual location. The available facts do not establish the exact motive behind the false or unsuccessful information. What they establish is the result. The child was not found where the message claimed he was. The case therefore remained unresolved. The ransom money was gone. The child was still missing, and the person who had received the money had disappeared again. The investigation now had to rely increasingly on evidence that could survive after the communications ended. One of the most important pieces of that evidence was the ransom itself. Because the money had been recorded and consisted largely of gold certificates, investigators had a potential method for tracking it. If the person who received the ransom attempted to spend the certificates, the bills might eventually be recognized. That possibility would not provide an immediate solution. It would take time. In 1932, there was no instant nationwide system through which investigators could see every financial transaction involving the ransom. The certificates had to be discovered when they resurfaced, and each discovery had to be connected to the larger investigation. The ransom, therefore, became a kind of delayed message. The letters from John had been designed to communicate directly with the family. The money could communicate indirectly with investigators if it appeared in circulation. Every time one of the certificates was spent, it had the potential to reveal something about the person who possessed it. But before that financial trail became useful, the investigation faced another major development. On May 12, 1932. A man searching for firewood discovered the body of a child approximately 4.5 miles from the Lindbergh home. The child was identified as Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. The medical examination concluded that he had died around the time of the kidnapping and that his death resulted from a severe blow to the head. The discovery changed the meaning of the ransom exchange completely. The family had paid $50,000 in the hope of recovering their son. Instead, the child had already died. The person who received the ransom had not returned him. The message about Nellie had not led to the child. The case was now a kidnapping and murder investigation. The question of motive became especially difficult. Why would a kidnapper who intended to demand money for the child's return allow the child to die? The available information did not provide a definitive answer. Investigators could examine the physical evidence and the ransom correspondence, but they could not simply reconstruct the offender's intentions. The death also meant that the ransom negotiations could no longer be evaluated solely as an effort to save a living victim. They had become part of the evidence surrounding a murder. Dr. Condon's involvement now had a different significance. He had personally communicated with John, delivered the ransom, and received the information about Nellie. His recollection of the mysterious man would later become important. But at this stage, investigators still did not have a confirmed identity. The case remained divided among several separate lines of evidence. There was the nursery and the damaged ladder. There were the ransom letters and their distinctive symbol. There was Condon's description of John. There was the body of the child. And there was the $50,000 that had disappeared into the hands of the kidnapper. The investigation would eventually attempt to connect all of these elements. The ladder could potentially reveal who constructed it. The letters could potentially reveal who wrote them. Condon could potentially recognize the man he had encountered. And the money could potentially reveal where the kidnapper had gone after the exchange. For the moment, however, the case remained without a definitive suspect. The Lindbergh family had lost the child they had been trying to recover. The person calling himself John had vanished after receiving the ransom. And investigators were left with a trail that seemed to lead in several directions at once. The gold certificates would prove to be especially important because, unlike a witness's memory or an anonymous letter, money could physically move from one person to another. It could cross neighborhoods, cities, and even states while leaving a record each time someone noticed it. In 1933, investigators would begin finding gold certificates connected to the ransom. But those discoveries would not immediately identify Hauptmann. The trail remained incomplete. For more than a year, the money moved through the financial system without revealing the person who had received it. Then, in August and September 1934, the certificates began appearing again in the New York area. Investigators started mapping where the bills were being used. A pattern began to emerge. The ransom that had disappeared during the exchange was no longer simply a memory from the kidnapping. It was moving through the streets of New York. Somewhere, someone was spending the money. And if investigators could determine who that person was, they might finally be able to connect the anonymous John to a real individual. The breakthrough would come not through another ransom letter, nor through another promise about the child, but through one of the most ordinary transactions imaginable. A man would stop at a gas station, purchase 5 gallons of gasoline, and attempt to pay with a $10 gold certificate. The attendant would notice something unusual, record the vehicle's license plate, and unknowingly create the link that investigators had been waiting for. The ransom had been paid more than 2 years earlier. The child was gone. The kidnapper had disappeared, but the money was still speaking. And soon, investigators would have a name: Bruno Richard Hauptmann. For more than 2 months after Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. disappeared, the question of his whereabouts remained unanswered. The ransom had been paid. Messages had been exchanged. Dr. John F. Condon had been given information claiming that the child was aboard a boat called Nellie near Martha's Vineyard. Search efforts had followed that information, but they had produced nothing. The family had been given a promise, and that promise had failed. Still, until May 12, 1932, there remained one possibility that investigators and the Lindbergh family could not completely abandon. Perhaps Charles Jr. was alive somewhere. The discovery that day ended that possibility. A man searching for firewood came across the body of a child in an area approximately 4.5 miles from the Lindbergh home near Hopewell, New Jersey. The discovery was devastating in its simplicity. After more than 2 months of uncertainty, investigators now had an answer to the most important question in the case. The child had not been taken somewhere far away and secretly held for ransom. He had died. The remains were in a severely deteriorated condition because of the passage of time, and the child had been buried only superficially. Identification established that the body was Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. The child who had disappeared from his nursery on the night of March 1st had been found only a few miles from the home, where he had been sleeping. The location added another disturbing dimension to the investigation. For more than 2 months, the family had been searching and negotiating while the child's body remained relatively close to the property. The discovery transformed the entire case. Until that moment, the ransom communications had remained connected to the hope of recovering a living child. The family had followed instructions, money had been delivered, and information about a supposed location had been investigated. But now the investigators had to examine the kidnapping through the fact of the child's death. It was no longer simply a question of finding a missing boy. It was a murder investigation. The medical examination provided an essential conclusion. Charles Jr. had died around the time of the kidnapping, rather than weeks later. His cause of death was determined to be a severe blow to the head. That finding meant that the child had likely died during the earliest stage of the crime. It also meant that the ransom negotiations had occurred after his death. The family had been communicating with someone who claimed to have control over the child's fate. But according to the medical conclusion, the child was already dead. This fact made the earlier message about the boat Nellie even more disturbing. The family had been directed toward a location where Charles Jr. was not present. Whether that information was deliberately false or resulted from another circumstance could not be established from the available facts. What was certain was that it did not lead investigators to the child. The discovery of the body also raised the question that would remain at the heart of the investigation. Why was a 20-month-old child killed? A kidnapping for ransom normally depended on the victim being alive. The purpose of the ransom demand was to exchange money for the person's return. Yet in this case, the child was dead. The evidence supplied does not establish a definitive motive for the killing. Investigators could determine how Charles Jr. died, but determining why he was killed was far more difficult. There was no answer contained in the body itself. There was no explanation left at the scene that could reveal the offender's intentions. The ransom letters offered demands for money, not a clear explanation of the child's fate. The investigation, therefore, had to proceed without a definitive motive. The focus shifted toward reconstructing the crime through physical and documentary evidence. The homemade wooden ladder became particularly important. It had been found beneath the nursery window and was believed to have been used to reach the second floor. Its condition suggested that something had gone wrong while it was being used. The ladder was not simply an incidental object. It was a physical connection between the outside of the house and the nursery where the child had been sleeping. Investigators examined its construction, including the type of wood, the way its components were assembled, the nails, and the tool marks left on the material. These details would later become important when investigators attempted to connect the ladder to a particular person. At the time of the child's body being discovered, however, the ladder was still only one piece of the puzzle. It could tell investigators something about how the offender reached the nursery, but it could not by itself reveal the offender's name. The ransom correspondence offered another trail. The first note demanded $50,000 and contained spelling errors, awkward language, and the distinctive symbol that would appear in later communications. The family eventually received 13 ransom-related letters. These letters represented an unusual form of evidence because they came directly from the person, claiming responsibility for the kidnapping. Unlike a physical object abandoned at the crime scene, the letters were deliberate communications. Their writer had chosen the words, the spelling, and the distinctive symbol. Those choices could later be examined. The handwriting could be compared with the writing of a suspect. The language could be studied for recurring characteristics. But again, the investigators did not yet know the identity of the author. The letters were evidence without a confirmed writer. Dr. John F. Condon provided another possible connection. Condon had communicated with the individual calling himself John and had participated in the ransom exchange. He had described the man he believed he had encountered as having a Scandinavian appearance. Investigators had used that description to create a sketch. But a sketch based on memory was not the same as a confirmed identity. The person behind the name John remained unknown. The investigation, therefore, had to work simultaneously along several paths. There was the crime scene, there was the body, there was the ladder, there were the ransom letters, there was Condon's account, and there was the ransom money. Each piece could potentially lead to the offender, but none had yet produced a definitive identification. The discovery of Charles Jr.'s body also changed the emotional character of the case. Before May 12th, the investigation had been driven by the possibility of rescue. After May 12th, that possibility was gone. The Lindbergh family could no longer wait for their child to be returned. The investigation now had a different purpose: to determine who had taken him and who was responsible for his death. The distinction was profound. The ransom negotiations had been an effort to recover a living child. The investigation after the discovery of the body became an effort to establish responsibility for a killing. The enormous public attention surrounding the Lindbergh name made this transformation even more significant. The case had already become one of the most closely watched crimes in the country. Now the public was not simply waiting for news of a missing child. It was waiting for the identity of a killer. Yet investigators still had no definitive suspect. The scale of the case generated thousands of leads. Some people claimed to have information. Others attempted to exploit the family's desperation. The investigation would later include false suspicions that caused additional tragedy, including the case of Violet Sharp, who was questioned in connection with the kidnapping and later died by suicide before investigators determined that she had no connection to the crime. These false leads demonstrated how difficult the search had become. A famous victim, a massive ransom, a mysterious offender, and an enormous amount of public attention created an environment in which almost any unusual detail could become the focus of suspicion. Investigators, therefore, had to determine which clues could survive careful examination. The body of Charles Jr. provided certainty about the outcome, but not about the killer. The latter provided a possible method of entry, but not an identity. The letters provided a potential sample of the offender's handwriting, but not a name. Condon provided a description of John, but not a verified identity. The ransom money provided the possibility of a financial trail, but it would take much longer before that trail produced a suspect. The case had entered a new phase, one in which investigators had to reconstruct events from fragments left behind by the crime. Charles Jr. had been taken from the second floor of his home. A ladder had been placed beneath the window. A ransom note had been left behind. The family had paid the demanded money. A false or unsuccessful lead had directed attention toward a boat near Martha's Vineyard. And now the child's body had been found only about 4.5 miles from the Lindbergh property. The evidence suggested that the crime had begun with a carefully planned attempt to enter the nursery. But the exact sequence of events remained unknown. Investigators could not ask the child what had happened. They could not rely on his testimony. The victim was gone, leaving only physical evidence and the accounts of others. That made the latter especially important. If investigators could determine who had constructed it, they might be able to identify the person who had entered the nursery. The latter could become more than evidence of entry. It could become a bridge between the crime scene and a suspect. That possibility would eventually lead investigators toward Bruno Richard Hauptmann. But on May 12, 1932, there was no such name attached to the case. There was only the terrible discovery of a child who should have been at home, and an investigation that had just become a murder investigation. The search for Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. was over. The search for the person responsible had only begun. With the discovery of Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr.'s body, investigators were no longer searching simply for a missing child. They were trying to reconstruct a crime that had left behind very few obvious answers. The ransom letters had been written by someone who concealed his identity. The person calling himself John had disappeared after receiving the money. The child was dead, and the medical examination had established that he had suffered a severe blow to the head. In the middle of this uncertainty stood one of the most tangible objects connected to the kidnapping, the homemade wooden ladder found beneath the nursery window. It was not merely evidence that someone had reached the second floor. It potentially represented a physical connection between the unknown offender and the crime scene. The ladder became one of the central objects examined by investigators because of its unusual construction. It was not a simple, commercially manufactured ladder that could easily be traced to a store or a particular owner. It had been constructed from pieces of wood and assembled with nails and other components. During its use, the ladder had broken or separated at one of its joints. That damage suggested that the attempt to reach the nursery had not gone perfectly. Investigators examined the ladder closely, looking at the type of wood, the way the pieces had been joined, the nails, the tool marks, and the methods used in its construction. Every physical characteristic offered another possible clue about the person who had made it. The importance of the ladder increased because the investigation had so few other direct physical connections to the offender. There had been no witness who saw the kidnapper carrying Charles Jr. away from the nursery. There was no confession. The person behind the ransom letters had used the name John, rather than providing a genuine identity. Condon had seen the man he believed was John, but his description could not immediately establish who that person was. The ladder, by contrast, was something the offender had physically constructed and brought to the scene. If investigators could identify the materials or tools used to make it, they might be able to connect it to a particular person. The investigation, therefore, became a process of comparison. Investigators looked at the wood used in the ladder and considered where similar material might have come from. They examined the construction techniques and the marks left by tools. Later, when Bruno Richard Hauptmann became a suspect, these details would become important. Experts would argue that part of the ladder corresponded to wood used as flooring in the attic of Hauptmann's home. Tool marks on the ladder were also presented as consistent with tools associated with him. These conclusions would become significant evidence for the prosecution. But the path toward Hauptmann did not begin with the ladder alone. In the months and years after the kidnapping, investigators confronted an enormous number of leads. The Lindbergh name ensured that the case received extraordinary attention, and that attention produced both genuine information and false claims. Thousands of tips were generated. Some individuals claimed to know the identity of the kidnapper. Others attempted to exploit the family's desperation for money or attention. Investigators had to distinguish useful information from deliberate deception and coincidence. The sheer volume of claims made the task more difficult. Every possible suspect required examination, but not every suspicion could be supported by evidence. One of the most tragic examples involved Violet Sharp, a woman who worked in the household of Anne Lindbergh's mother. She became the subject of suspicion during the investigation. Under the pressure of questioning and suspicion, she took her own life with poison in June 1932. Subsequent investigation determined that she had not been involved in the kidnapping. Her death illustrated the destructive consequences of an investigation conducted under enormous public pressure. Suspicion could fall on people who had no connection to the crime, and once suspicion became public, the consequences could be irreversible. The authorities therefore needed evidence that was stronger than rumor. The ransom letters offered one possible avenue. There were 13 communications connected with the ransom, and the distinctive symbol appearing in them provided a recurring feature. The handwriting could be examined and compared. Later, when Hauptmann was arrested, FBI handwriting experts compared his writing with the ransom letters and concluded that there were significant similarities and that Hauptmann was the author. This became another major component of the prosecution's case. Yet handwriting evidence, like the latter evidence, was part of a larger chain rather than a single definitive observation that independently proved the kidnapping. The investigation gradually became dependent on the accumulation of clues. The latter suggested a connection to the construction skills and materials of the eventual suspect. The ransom letters provided a handwriting comparison. Condon could identify Hauptmann as the man he believed he had met under the name John. The ransom money could potentially connect the suspect to the financial demands. And investigators found another striking detail at Hauptmann's home. The address and telephone number of Dr. Condon had been written on a frame inside a closet. That discovery was especially important because Condon was not simply a random person connected to the case. He had been the intermediary who communicated with the kidnapper and delivered the ransom. The presence of Condon's contact information in Hauptmann's home would later be presented as another connection between Hauptmann and the kidnapping. Still, none of these clues had immediately identified Hauptmann after the body was discovered. More than 2 years would pass before the investigation reached him. During that time, the ransom money remained an increasingly important possibility. The $50,000 had been delivered in gold certificates, and those certificates were marked and tracked. The purpose was clear. If the kidnapper spent the money, investigators might be able to follow it. In 1933, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York discovered 296 $10 bills and one $20 bill connected to the Lindbergh ransom. Investigators attempted to trace the person who had deposited or circulated them, but the effort did not lead directly to Hauptmann. The money had resurfaced, but the trail still did not produce the identity investigators wanted. Then, in August and September 1934, gold certificates connected to the ransom began appearing again in the New York area. Investigators mapped the places where the bills were being used. Slowly, a geographical pattern began to emerge. The ransom money was moving through a particular area, and that movement offered investigators a new way to narrow the search. This was fundamentally different from chasing anonymous tips. The money was physical evidence that could be tracked from transaction to transaction. Every bill carried a connection to the original ransom payment. Every appearance created another opportunity to identify the person using it. The investigation was now approaching the point where the anonymous kidnapper could no longer remain entirely invisible. Yet the final breakthrough would come through an ordinary transaction. On September 15, 1934, a man stopped at a New York gas station and purchased 5 gallons of gasoline. He attempted to pay with a $10 gold certificate. The attendant recognized the transaction as unusual because gold certificates were no longer commonly used. Instead of simply accepting the bill and forgetting about it, the attendant became suspicious. He recorded the license plate of the customer's automobile. It was a small action, almost insignificant when viewed against the enormous scale of the Lindbergh investigation. But it created the connection investigators needed. The license plate was traced to its registered owner. The vehicle belonged to Bruno Richard Hauptmann. For more than 2 years, the case had revolved around an unknown person who had entered a nursery at night, taken a child, demanded money, and disappeared. Now investigators had a name attached to the trail of the ransom. Bruno Richard Hauptmann was not merely an abstract possibility. He was a real person living in New York, and his connection to the gold certificate demanded immediate attention. Investigators began looking into his background. Hauptmann had been born in Saxony, Germany. He had worked as a carpenter and had a criminal record involving robbery in Germany. He had eventually come to the United States and settled in New York. He married Anna Schoeffler in 1925, and the couple had a son in 1933. There was another detail that drew attention. After the Lindbergh kidnapping, Hauptmann did not continue working as a carpenter in the same way. Instead, he became active in stock trading. Investigators questioned where his money came from and whether his financial circumstances could be connected to the ransom. The trail that had begun with a note on a nursery window had now moved through ransom negotiations. A damaged ladder, anonymous letters, a failed search near Martha's Vineyard, and years of financial transactions. It had finally reached one man. The question was no longer simply who had taken Charles Jr., it was whether Bruno Richard Hauptmann was the person behind the entire chain of evidence. The answer would soon become the focus of one of the most famous criminal investigations and trials in American history. By September 1934, more than 2 years had passed since Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. had been taken from his nursery. The investigation had produced an enormous amount of information, but the person responsible remained officially unidentified. Then, on September 15th, an ordinary transaction at a New York gas station created the breakthrough investigators had been waiting for. A man stopped to purchase 5 gallons of gasoline and attempted to pay with a $10 gold certificate. The attendant found the payment suspicious because gold certificates were no longer commonly used. Rather than ignoring the unusual bill, he recorded the license plate of the customer's automobile. That decision created a direct connection between one of the surviving pieces of ransom money and a specific person. Investigators traced the license plate to Bruno Richard Hauptmann. The name immediately became important because the money was not ordinary cash. It was connected to the ransom that had been delivered more than 2 years earlier in exchange for Charles Lindbergh Jr. The discovery meant that investigators could now move from an anonymous trail of currency toward an identifiable individual. They began examining Hauptmann's background and circumstances. Hauptmann had been born in Saxony, Germany. He had worked as a carpenter and had a previous criminal record involving robbery in Germany. He had eventually come to the United States after complicated immigration experiences and settled in New York. In 1925, he married Anna Schoeffler. The couple later had a son in 1933. On the surface, Hauptmann had established a family life in America. But investigators became interested in his finances, particularly because his activities after the Lindbergh kidnapping raised questions. Rather than continuing to work as a carpenter, Hauptmann began trading stocks. Investigators wanted to know where his money came from and whether his financial circumstances could be connected to the ransom. The gas station transaction was therefore not treated as an isolated event. It became the beginning of an intensive examination of Hauptmann and his possessions. On September 19, 1934, approximately 2 years and 6 months after the kidnapping, investigators moved to arrest him. At around 9 o'clock that morning, Hauptmann left his home. Investigators followed and took him into custody. When he was arrested, he was carrying a $20 gold certificate that was identified as part of the Lindbergh ransom. The significance of that discovery was difficult to dismiss. The investigation had been tracking ransom money, and Hauptmann was now found with one of the certificates. But the evidence did not stop there. Investigators searched his garage and discovered more than $13,000 in ransom money. Hidden there, part of the money was found inside a gasoline can. The discovery gave prosecutors a much larger physical connection between Hauptmann and the ransom. The case had begun with a mysterious note demanding money. Now, years later, investigators had found a substantial amount of that money in the possession of one man. The financial evidence became one of the central pillars of the prosecution's case. Yet the investigators still had to establish whether the money was enough to connect Hauptmann to the kidnapping itself. Possession of ransom money was powerful evidence. But prosecutors would need to demonstrate that the other major pieces of the investigation also pointed toward the same person. The first of those pieces was the ladder. Investigators examined the homemade wooden ladder found beneath the nursery window and compared its materials and construction with objects associated with Hauptmann. Experts concluded that part of the wood used in the ladder corresponded with wood from the flooring in the attic of Hauptmann's home. They also examined tool marks and concluded that marks on the ladder were consistent with tools associated with Hauptmann. The ladder, therefore, offered a possible physical connection between the crime scene and the suspect. It was particularly significant because Hauptmann had worked as a carpenter. His occupation meant that he possessed the skills and tools necessary to construct a wooden ladder of the kind investigators had found at the Lindbergh property. The prosecution would eventually argue that the ladder was not merely evidence of the method used to reach the nursery. It was evidence that connected the construction of the device to Hauptmann himself. Another major line of evidence involved handwriting. The ransom letters contained spelling mistakes, unusual expressions, and the distinctive symbol that appeared repeatedly. After Hauptmann's arrest, FBI handwriting experts compared his writing with the ransom correspondence. According to the FBI, the experts found significant similarities in the handwriting characteristics and concluded that Hauptmann was the writer of the ransom letters. This conclusion became another important part of the prosecution's argument. The person who had demanded the ransom had written the letters, and investigators now claimed that those letters matched Hauptmann's handwriting. But the case did not depend entirely on handwriting. Dr. John F. Condon provided another connection. Condon had been the intermediary who communicated with the man calling himself John. He had personally encountered that man and had previously described him as having a Scandinavian appearance. After Hauptmann's arrest, Condon identified him as the person he had known as John. That identification gave prosecutors a direct human connection between Hauptmann and the ransom exchange. It meant that, according to Condon, the man who had received the ransom was the same man now sitting in police custody. The investigators also found an unusual connection between Hauptmann and Condon inside Hauptmann's home. The address and telephone number of Dr. Condon were written on a frame inside a closet. The significance of this discovery was obvious to investigators. Condon had not been an ordinary participant in the case. He was the man who had acted as intermediary, communicated with the kidnapper, and delivered the ransom. Finding Condon's contact information inside Hauptmann's home offered another link between the suspect and a person who had been directly involved in the ransom negotiations. The investigation also examined Hauptmann's automobile. He owned a Dodge sedan that was considered consistent with descriptions of a vehicle seen near the Lindbergh property in connection with the crime. Once again, this was not a single piece of evidence that independently established guilt. Instead, it became part of a larger chain. The prosecution was assembling a case in which the money, handwriting, ladder, intermediary, contact information, and vehicle all appeared to point toward the same individual. Hauptmann, however, did not accept that interpretation. From the beginning, he denied kidnapping or killing Charles Lindbergh Jr. He maintained that he was innocent. His denial became one of the defining features of the case. The investigators had no confession from him. There was no witness who had seen him physically take the child from the nursery. No one had caught him at the Lindbergh home. The prosecution, therefore, had to rely heavily on a combination of physical evidence and circumstantial evidence. That distinction would become important as the case moved toward trial. The question was not whether investigators had evidence connecting Hauptmann to the ransom. They clearly did. The larger question was whether the entire collection of evidence proved beyond a reasonable doubt that he had committed the kidnapping and murder. The prosecution believed that the answer was yes. Hauptmann continued to insist that it was no. The investigation had now reached its most important stage. For years, the ransom money had been moving through the New York area without revealing the person responsible. A $10 certificate and an alert gas station attendant had finally provided a license plate. The license plate had led to Hauptmann. The search of his property had produced thousands of dollars in ransom money. His writing was compared with the ransom letters. His tools and materials were examined in relation to the ladder. Condon identified him as the mysterious John. His home contained Condon's address and telephone number. His automobile was considered consistent with a vehicle connected to the investigation. Each piece of evidence appeared to strengthen the others. Yet the central mystery of what had happened inside the nursery remained dependent on reconstruction, rather than direct observation. Hauptmann was now the suspect, but the investigation still had to prove its case in court. On January 3, 1935, that process would begin in Flemington, New Jersey. The trial would place the ransom money, the ladder, the handwriting, Condon's identification, and every other major piece of evidence before a jury. It would also give Hauptmann the opportunity to tell his side of the story. For the first time, the entire chain of evidence would be tested publicly. The man who had been connected to the ransom money was no longer an unknown figure hidden behind the name John. He was Bruno Richard Hauptmann, sitting in custody and facing a charge that could cost him his life. On January 3, 1935, Bruno Richard Hauptmann's case moved from the investigative stage into the courtroom. The trial began in Flemington, New Jersey, and almost immediately became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in the United States. The kidnapping of Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. had already captured national attention, but the trial brought the major evidence into one place. The defendant was no longer an unidentified figure connected to an anonymous ransom. Bruno Richard Hauptmann was now formally accused of the crime, and the prosecution had to demonstrate that the evidence connecting him to the kidnapping was strong enough to establish his guilt. The case was unusual because the prosecution did not have a direct eyewitness to the kidnapping itself. No witness had watched Hauptmann enter the nursery, take Charles Jr., and leave the Lindbergh property. There was no confession from Hauptmann. Instead, the prosecution presented a chain of evidence. The argument depended on the idea that multiple independent clues pointed toward the same conclusion. The ransom money was one of the most powerful parts of that chain. Investigators had traced gold certificates from the ransom payment and eventually connected some of them to Hauptmann. When he was arrested, he had a $20 gold certificate associated with the ransom. Investigators then searched his property and found more than $13,000 in ransom money hidden in his garage, including money concealed inside a gasoline can. The discovery placed a substantial amount of the ransom in the possession of the defendant. The prosecution presented this evidence as a direct financial connection between Hauptmann and the kidnapping. The defense, however, maintained that Hauptmann was innocent. His position remained consistent. He denied kidnapping Charles Jr. and denied killing him. That denial meant the jury had to evaluate the physical and circumstantial evidence rather than rely on a confession. Another major part of the prosecution's case concerned the ransom letters. The original ransom note left in the nursery had demanded $50,000 and contained distinctive spelling errors, awkward language, and a recognizable symbol consisting of a circle-like mark with 2 dots. Additional letters connected to the ransom negotiations contained the same distinctive feature. Investigators had preserved these communications, and after Hauptmann's arrest, his handwriting was compared with the ransom letters. FBI handwriting experts testified that they found significant similarities and concluded that Hauptmann had written the ransom correspondence. The handwriting evidence was important because it attempted to connect the anonymous John directly to the defendant. If the letters had been written by Hauptmann, then the man who had demanded the ransom and communicated with Dr. John F. Condon would no longer be anonymous. The prosecution could argue that the handwriting evidence helped establish that Hauptmann was the person behind the ransom communications. The latter was another central part of the trial. Investigators had recovered the homemade wooden ladder beneath the nursery window. Its construction was unusual enough to warrant detailed examination. Experts analyzed the wood, the way the ladder had been assembled, the nails, and the tool marks. The prosecution presented evidence that part of the ladder corresponded with wood used for flooring. In the attic of Hauptmann's home, Tool marks were also presented as consistent with tools associated with him. Because Hauptmann had worked as a carpenter, the latter evidence carried particular significance. It suggested not only that he possessed the practical skills needed to construct such an object, but that materials and tools connected to him could be associated with the ladder used during the kidnapping. Again, the prosecution's case depended on accumulation. The ladder did not contain a label identifying its maker. It was the combination of wood, construction, and tool evidence that prosecutors argued pointed toward Hauptmann. Dr. John F. Condon provided another crucial element. Condon had entered the investigation as a volunteer intermediary and had communicated directly with the man calling himself John. He had participated in the ransom exchange and had personally encountered the man behind the name. Earlier, Condon had described that person as having a Scandinavian appearance. During the trial, his identification of Hauptmann became an important piece of testimony. According to Condon, Hauptmann was the man he had encountered as John. This was significant because it provided the prosecution with a witness who claimed to connect the defendant to the ransom negotiations. The evidence went beyond Condon's physical identification. Investigators had discovered the address and telephone number of Dr. Condon written on a frame inside a closet at Hauptmann's home. The prosecution could present this as another link between the defendant and the intermediary who had been central to the ransom exchange. It was difficult to explain away the presence of Condon's contact information when considered alongside the other evidence, and prosecutors used it as part of the larger chain. The prosecution also introduced evidence concerning Hauptmann's automobile. He owned a Dodge sedan considered consistent with descriptions of a vehicle seen near the Lindbergh property in connection with the kidnapping. The vehicle evidence was not as direct as the ransom money, but it added another possible connection between Hauptmann and the circumstances surrounding the crime. His financial activities also attracted attention. Investigators had become interested in the fact that after the kidnapping, Hauptmann was no longer working as a carpenter in the same manner and had begun trading stocks. The question was where his money came from. When more than $13,000 of ransom money was found hidden in his garage, the financial issue became far more significant. The prosecution now had a possible explanation for money that otherwise might have seemed difficult to account for. The trial therefore presented the jury with a complex collection of evidence. Some of it was physical, some was financial, some depended on expert analysis, some depended on human memory and identification. None showed the kidnapping itself. The prosecution's challenge was to persuade the jury that these separate pieces were not isolated coincidences but parts of a single story. According to that story, Hauptmann was connected to the ransom money, the ransom letters, the ladder, Condon, and other circumstances surrounding the crime. The defense's position was fundamentally different. Hauptmann continued to deny the crime and maintained his innocence. The absence of a confession and the lack of a direct eyewitness to the kidnapping meant that the case remained dependent on the jury's assessment of circumstantial evidence. The trial also carried enormous public pressure. Charles Lindbergh himself appeared in court and testified. His presence underscored the extraordinary importance of the proceedings. The victim's father was not simply a distant name associated with the case. He was present as a witness while the evidence concerning his son's kidnapping and death was presented. The trial lasted approximately 5 weeks. During that period, the prosecution worked through the major evidence that had accumulated during the investigation. The ransom money demonstrated a financial connection. The handwriting analysis attempted to connect Hauptmann to the ransom letters. The latter evidence attempted to connect him to the method of entry. Condon's testimony connected him to the man known as John. The address and telephone number found in his home provided another connection to Condon. The automobile evidence and financial circumstances added further context. The case became a test of whether those individual pieces could form a convincing whole. On February 13, 1935, the jury reached its decision. Bruno Richard Hauptmann was found guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was death. For the prosecution, and for many members of the public. The verdict represented the conclusion of a massive investigation that had lasted nearly 3 years. The man who had been connected to the ransom money had now been convicted of the murder of Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., but the verdict did not end the controversy. Hauptmann continued to insist that he was innocent. He maintained that he had not kidnapped or killed the child, despite the extensive evidence presented against him. His appeals therefore became the next stage of the case. The New Jersey Supreme Court upheld the conviction in October 1935, and the United States Supreme Court declined to review the case in December 1935. The legal path available to Hauptmann was narrowing rapidly. Yet the central feature of the case remained unchanged. He had been convicted through a powerful chain of circumstantial and physical evidence rather than through a confession or a witness who had directly observed the kidnapping. The trial had established the prosecution's version of events in the eyes of the jury, but Hauptmann never accepted it. His insistence on innocence would continue until the end of his life. The sentence now stood. Unless further legal or executive action intervened, Bruno Richard Hauptmann would be executed. The kidnapping that had begun with a note demanding $50,000 had now reached its final legal stage. A child had been taken from a second-floor nursery, a ransom had been paid, a body had been discovered, and a trail of money had eventually led investigators to a German-born carpenter in New York. The jury had accepted the prosecution's chain of evidence and declared him guilty. The final question was no longer whether Hauptmann would face trial. It was whether he would be granted any final reprieve before the sentence was carried out. After Bruno Richard Hauptmann was convicted of first-degree murder on February 13, 1935, the Lindbergh kidnapping entered its final legal stage. The jury had accepted the prosecution's case, which had been built from a long chain of evidence. The ransom money, the handwriting analysis, the homemade ladder, Dr. John F. Condon's identification, the contact information found in Hauptmann's home, and other circumstances connecting him to the crime. The verdict carried the ultimate punishment available under New Jersey law. Hauptmann was sentenced to death. Yet the conviction did not silence the controversy surrounding the case. Hauptmann continued to insist that he was innocent. He denied kidnapping Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. and denied killing him. His position remained unchanged even as the legal process moved forward. That continued denial became one of the most enduring features of the case. The prosecution had presented a powerful collection of evidence, but there had never been a confession from Hauptmann, nor had there been a witness who had directly watched him remove the child from the nursery. The conviction therefore rested on the cumulative strength of the evidence rather than a single piece of direct testimony establishing every stage of the crime. Hauptmann's lawyers pursued appeals. The case was reviewed by the New Jersey Supreme Court, which upheld the conviction in October 1935. The defense then sought review by the United States Supreme Court, but in December 1935, the nation's highest court declined to take the case. The legal avenues were rapidly narrowing. Hauptmann remained in prison, still facing execution. There were efforts to save his life. Some people continued to believe that questions surrounding the evidence justified further consideration. The controversy was not enough to overturn the conviction, but it contributed to continued attempts to obtain a reprieve. The governor of New Jersey at one point postponed the execution, delaying the scheduled punishment. But the postponement did not become a permanent reprieve. Eventually, the efforts to obtain clemency failed. The final date was set. On April 3, 1936, more than 4 years after Charles Jr. had been taken from his nursery, Bruno Richard Hauptmann was brought to the execution chamber in New Jersey. At 8:47 p.m., he was executed in the electric chair. His death brought a formal end to the prosecution of the man who had been convicted of the Lindbergh child's murder. But it did not erase the questions that had surrounded the investigation. Hauptmann had maintained his innocence until the end. The case remained one of the most controversial criminal investigations in American history because of the nature of the evidence and the enormous public attention surrounding the trial. Yet whatever questions remained about the evidence, the historical consequences of the kidnapping extended far beyond Hauptmann's execution. The crime had exposed a serious limitation in American law. In 1932, when Charles Jr. was kidnapped, the FBI did not possess the broad federal authority over kidnapping cases that it would later receive. Investigators had to work within a system in which state authorities remained central and less federal. Jurisdiction could be established through other circumstances. The Lindbergh case demonstrated how difficult that structure could become when a kidnapping involved movement across state lines. Congress responded quickly. On June 22, 1932, the Federal Kidnapping Act was passed. The law became widely known as the Lindbergh Law. It gave federal authorities greater power to investigate kidnappings that crossed state boundaries. The legislation represented a major change in the federal government's role in kidnapping investigations. The crime that had devastated the Lindbergh family, therefore, became one of the forces that reshaped how similar crimes would be investigated in the United States. The case also had a significant connection to the development of forensic investigation. The FBI laboratory was still relatively young, and the Lindbergh investigation became one of the prominent cases in which scientific and technical examination of evidence played a major role. Handwriting analysis was used to compare Hauptmann's writing with the ransom letters. Physical evidence from the latter was examined in an effort to identify its materials and construction. The investigation demonstrated the growing importance of using physical evidence to build a criminal case rather than relying only on eyewitness testimony. The Lindbergh case also showed the dangers inherent in an investigation conducted under intense public pressure. The enormous fame of Charles Lindbergh meant that the kidnapping was never simply a private criminal matter. The case generated thousands of leads, many of which were false or unreliable. People claimed to possess information. Others attempted to exploit the family's desperation. Suspicion fell upon individuals who ultimately proved to have no connection to the crime. The case of Violet Sharp was one of the most tragic examples. Sharp, who worked in the household of Lindbergh's mother, became the subject of suspicion during the investigation. In June 1932, while facing further questioning, she died by suicide using poison. The investigation later established that she had no connection to the kidnapping. Her death demonstrated how suspicion itself could become destructive, particularly when an investigation was surrounded by intense public attention and uncertainty. The story of the Lindbergh kidnapping, therefore, cannot be reduced simply to the question of whether a particular man was convicted. It also concerns the consequences of fear, fame, pressure, and incomplete information. The investigators were working with a dead child, an anonymous offender, ransom letters, a damaged ladder, and a trail of money that took years to develop. They had to decide which evidence was meaningful and which was coincidence. They also had to contend with the public demand for an answer. Eventually, that search led to Hauptmann. The ransom money proved especially important. In 1933, investigators found 296 $10 bills and one $20 bill from the ransom. Those discoveries did not immediately identify Hauptmann. It was only after gold certificates began appearing again in the New York area during August and September 1934 that investigators were able to map their circulation and narrow the geographical trail. The $10 certificate used at a gas station on September 15th became the crucial link. The attendant noticed the unusual payment and recorded the vehicle's license plate. That plate led to Hauptmann. For days later, investigators arrested him. A $20 ransom certificate was found on him, and more than $13,000 of ransom money was discovered in his garage. The case had reached its suspect through a remarkably ordinary act: someone paying for gasoline. That detail remains one of the most striking aspects of the investigation. The crime had begun with a carefully constructed ladder, a nighttime intrusion, a ransom note, and the disappearance of a famous man's child. Yet the trail that eventually led investigators to Hauptmann was carried by money moving through. Ordinary transactions. A $10 certificate was enough to turn a mysterious financial trail into a license plate, a license plate into a name, and a name into an arrest. The tragedy itself remained much larger than the eventual conviction. Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. had been only 20 months old when he was taken from his nursery. His body was found approximately 4.5 miles from his home more than 2 months later. The medical examination determined that he had died around the time of the kidnapping after suffering a severe blow to the head. His parents had paid the ransom hoping to recover him alive, but that hope was never fulfilled. The identity of the person who caused his death became the subject of a massive investigation and a historic trial. Hauptmann was convicted and executed, and the legal system accepted the prosecution's evidence as sufficient to establish his guilt. But his repeated insistence that he was innocent ensured that the case would remain a subject of debate. The Lindbergh kidnapping also left a lasting mark on American society because it changed the law. The Federal Kidnapping Act gave federal authorities a greater role in investigating kidnappings that cross state lines, helping establish a framework that would influence future cases. In that sense, the crime did not end with the execution in 1936. Its consequences continued through the American legal and investigative systems. More than anything else, however, the story remains centered on the child whose name first appeared in the headlines because he was missing. Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. was taken from his home during the night. His family waited, negotiated, paid the ransom, and searched for him. The promise of his return proved false. His body was eventually discovered nearby, and the investigation that followed consumed years. The case ended with a conviction and an execution, but its deepest lesson is not the image of the condemned man. It is the reminder that behind every famous criminal case is a victim whose life cannot be restored by a verdict. The Lindbergh kidnapping changed American law, advanced the use of forensic evidence, and became one of the most closely followed criminal cases of its era. But before it was a legal landmark or a historical mystery, it was the story of a 20-month-old child who should have been safe in his own home. That is where the story began, and that is where its human meaning remains.